We are delighted today to introduce to you French-Venezuelan filmmaker and biologist Alexis Gambis. His films combine documentary and fiction, often embracing animal perspectives and experimenting with new forms of scientific storytelling. He's also been running a really exciting film festival for the last 15 years, although he just stepped down as the director of the film festival, I think, but he'll talk about that. He also runs this incredible VOD, which means video on demand, although that's kind of an antiquated term now, platform called Labocine, which I think is awesome, and AUP will shortly have a subscription to it, so you guys will have access to it. As well as being a professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, incredible pedagogical experience. And what else? He holds a PhD in molecular biology, and his passion is really in bringing films and science in conversation. And he does this by a whole bunch of things. So making films, so you guys will see his amazing film tonight called Sons of Monarchs. And he also throws scientists and filmmakers together, which is how I got to know him, through this awesome competition that he held through a film festival called Symbiosis. We had 1 week to make a film, and we were paired up at random with a scientist. And out came this fun, I love this short film that I made. It's about grasshoppers and the Anthropocene. So anyways, and yeah, I guess the last thing I want to say is, I did my bachelor's degree in environmental science, and then I kind of became all consumed by film, and then I did my PhD in film. And it is so hard to find this tribe of people who do and who are passionate by film and science. And often you find it as like films representing science, documentaries representing science, instead of really thinking about the really unique and wonderful approach that these two disciplines can have. And Alexis, for me, is this like gem, amazing person who really does and really thinks through very uniquely through science and all through film, using both imaginaries, both sets of thinking as a mode of inquiry into the world. So I'm incredibly excited that he's here today. He's also a Parisian-based filmmaker in part, so all kinds of wonderful things. So here's my introduction, and without further ado, here's Alexis Gambis.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I have all of these identities. I really don't know where I'm from or what I do at this point. It's just like all these blurred identities that come together. I'm very excited to be here to talk a little bit about my trajectory, and then later on today we will also do a little workshop, and I'll kind of bring you into my world of kind of microscopy and looking at the world through like kind of a magnified lens, which is a big part of my work. But today what I'm going to talk about, you should all have maybe received the Science New Wave. This is a film movement that I started a number of years ago that is sort of at the core of what I do, both as a filmmaker, as a biologist, but also as a curator. The idea is really to change or to sort of redefine how we have scientists and filmmakers collaborate together and expand sort of this space of how do we create science stories that are not only documentary or science fiction, but also kind of in the space of science in fiction, embracing not only kind of the factual, but also the dreams, the magical realism. And so we came up with this manifesto, which is sort of, as other film movements that have been done over the years, including sort of inspired by the French New Wave, the idea is to break conventions and how we think about scientists in films, and also kind of leave space for multiple ways in which we approach scientific stories. So the manifesto has these traits, as you'll read. I spent a lot of my time just handing them out in the street. This is like one of my part-time gigs. I go outside of the subways and I do this. I plaster it on the walls, and I think it's an interesting way to also have people not think about your films in categories, say like, oh, I make fiction movies or I make documentary, but I've started telling people that I make films that are from the Science New Wave, and then have people sort of incite them to kind of read about it and learn about what this means. The other thing that I'll mention about the New Wave is that instead of thinking about a movement as having rules, you know, like a doctrine that, you know, thinking about, for example, Dogma 95 and other movements, the way I sort of define the Science New Wave is that it's a living organism, and it has specific traits, you know, like specific characters that I want people to think about when they make films. You know, the same way as we may have black hair or blue eyes, there's like traits that are important to think about as we start thinking about what this organism looks like. But as any organism, it also develops, it evolves, and it has both like a genetic sort of destiny, but also it has all of these environmental factors that come in. So the idea is that the Science New Wave will continue evolving, and other people and other filmmakers will come in and provide their own perspective on it. And so I hope that it sort of inspires all of you. So how did I start? I'm just going to give a little background on my world. I spent around 10 years of my life, or a little less than that, 8 years, working on fruit flies. I know it sounds a little bit sad, but I spent most of my 20s looking through a microscope and studying fruit flies, because fruit flies is an important model in the sciences. It's what we call a model organism. And we can study a lot of human disease and human development. You know, we can study all aspects about how, you know, the functioning of a cell, to understanding diseases like Parkinson and neurodegenerative diseases. And the reason we can do that is because we understand sort of the genetics of this animal, and we can do crosses. Has anybody ever done fruit fly experiments in their past? Nobody has, right? Well, it's very common when you study genetics to, even when you're in college, you work on these. And I was studying, the reason I mention this is that I was studying vision, which is a very big field, which is trying to understand the genes that are important for color vision. And the reason why it's important to study this on flies is that many of these genes also exist in humans. So by studying flies, we can also understand color vision in humans. But the reason I mention this is that my sort of obsession and interest in studying how we can sort of break down vision in an animal, not only in flies but also in human beings, got me interested in film, because it was this idea of like, how do we see the world? How do we deconstruct the world that is out there? And one of the things that we do a lot, which kind of ties also to film, is that in order to study something at a biological level, the only way to do it is to tag it with fluorescence. This is how we do it in the sciences. We use fluorescent that comes from other animals, from jellyfish, from coral reef. And as science fiction as this sounds, we take these fluorescent genes that glow, like in fireflies as well, and we put it into these animals, and we can get them to glow. So here what you're seeing is a green fruit fly that is glowing because it has the fluorescence that comes from jellyfish, and we put it in and we can actually have it glow. And why do we have it glow? Because we need to see we need to see the cells that we're studying. And we can then specifically have the cells glow in compartments of the insect. And I know I'm going very science heavy right now, but I will shift into the film world very quickly. But what you see there is the fly eye, and the fly eyes, instead of having one eye, it has like 500 different eyes. They're called ommatidias, and it's like this repeated unit, and each one of them is involved in detecting one pixel. And so what I was doing to some extent is that I was painting these eyes with fluorescence to be able to study them, and I started becoming really interested in sort of the animal world and animal perspectives. And I started making these short films when I was a PhD student, because it was a long PhD, it was like 7 years. I would bring friends that were actors and performers, and I would bring them into the lab, and I would start making these films that were somewhat connected to my research. And at the same time, they were like, you know, films that would sort of enter into these like magical realism like environments and go into the imaginary. And so what you see here at the bottom was one of the first films, one of my early films, which is about a scientist that studies fruit flies, and he meets this woman, and while they meet and, you know, they have sort of this romance, he turns into a huge fruit fly. And so this is how my mind works. And by the way, all of these films, if anybody wants to watch any of these are films that are available on the platform that Isabelle mentioned as well. So I know that there's a class on Luis Buñuel here for some of you that take it. Definitely a very big inspiration in my own work. I've been very inspired by the Surrealist movement, and I feel like a lot of my work is sort of science magical realism and how to use images and scientific data to kind of enter into these spaces. But I think this quote by Luis Buñuel, "Give me 2 hours of day of activity and I'll take the other 2 in dreams," is something that penetrates a lot of my work. This idea of not only focusing on the activity of doing science and the process of doing science, but then allowing us to use the devices, especially in the lab, like the microscope, to enter into parallel worlds and to also enter into the mind of an animal, into like sort of channeling those spirits. And this is an Eye of a Fly in its early development, and just how beautiful are these images. I mean, maybe I'm the only one who finds them beautiful, but these are photoreceptor cells. These are the cells that are important for detecting color vision. And using different tags, you can actually see sort of the nuclear DNA of it, and you can also see the cells around it. But this is sort of the landscapes of a developing eye in an insect. And so, as I was constructing my own, trajectory and doing my research, I realized, and I should also mention that both my parents are artists. My father's a painter and my mom's a filmmaker. And I was trying to sort of combine this very sort of elusive world of art and science and trying to figure out ways of putting them together. And really what sort of fueled sort of my interest was this idea of how do we create stories that combine both of these aspects? And also, how do we focus on kind of, how do I make films that are both biographical but also kind of touch upon big scientific issues as well? And E.O. Wilson is a naturalist, a population geneticist that died recently, and he spoke a little bit about the importance of combining art and science in not only in doing scientific research but also in the construction of stories. I'm going to show you a clip. This is a film that I made also early on. This was me trying to understand the relationship with my own father and also combining it with early research that I was doing on memory. And I was already starting to combine this idea of, okay, what happens when I make a film that combines kind of this field of memory, the mouse, which is, again, the animal that is often used to study memory, and also make a film that had kind of elements of my father, the relationship with my father. So I'll show you a little trailer of this.
Et voilà, c'était combien de temps là, t'as vu
3 jours.
Tu penses que c'est le moment des jolis de ton père comme ça?
Après ce qu'il t'a fait, maman? No way, quoi.
Mon fils est arrivé de New York. Ah bon? Ouais. C'est que votre fils? Ah, mon fils est chercheur. Il travaille sur des rats, sur la mémoire. Hôpital, service de chirurgie cardiovasculaire, 7e étage.
Tu reconnais ou pas?
Ben, c'est Prospect Park, là où, à côté de là où on habitait.
So just kind of giving you, giving you sort of like a little glimpse into the world that I was trying to create, and early on, and something that I was also speaking about a lot with Isabelle is oftentimes when we make science films, there is sort of this resistance to combine documentary and fiction. And one of the things that I was interested in is how do we take, sort of the factual, like the research, but also how do we find ways in which we can incorporate these elements of fiction to it. And the whole other layer as well is, you know, what happens when you make films about your own life, and this idea of revisiting your own archives, and thinking about this. You know, this was a film where I used footage that my dad shot me from the age of, I think, 3 years old to 12, with this, you know, with these old Hi-8 cameras and Super 8, and I wanted to use that also as sort of scientific data and find ways in which I could take that and sort of tell a story about memory, about how we study memory on rats, and kind of incorporate these elements of the factual and fiction and sort of combine those two together. But before any of these films, the first ever film that I shot when I was a biology student was, again, my obsession with the microscope. I made this film about a scientist who goes inside the microscope. So he actually enters, he goes inside of it, and he falls in love with a very tiny microscopic woman that lives in a microscopic city, which is right there. And this was shot on Super 8, and so they have this sort of romance for a brief second, but they can't really stay together because they're from different worlds. They're from different scales. She's in this sort of a miniature world. And so I sort of used New York City as sort of this petri dish, and I created this film about the scientist sort of that travels through scale into these magnified worlds. And again, a lot of my work has been kind of focusing on animal perspectives, and the animal is an interesting sort of character and hero in my films, because the animal, we oftentimes study animals, right? We have sort of these relationships to animals, we feel empathy, but there's also kind of this cruelty that we do to animals. And animals became a way for me to also speak about the science, speak about critical issues around, you know, climate change, around endangered species, but also give a voice to these animals and allow them to kind of speak about their own fate and their own stories. And as Isabelle was mentioning, I've spent a few years, I'm actually on my way out now, but I spent a few years teaching at NYU in Abu Dhabi. And over there, there's this very kind of sort of mythological, or sort of the emblematic animal of the UAE is the oryx, right? That has sort of these amazing horns and is an animal of the desert. And I made a film in 2016 about an oryx that was genetically modified to speak, to be able to speak, and it starts communicating with this man that stutters, and it actually helps this man overcome his stuttering. And the first word that the oryx says is insan, which means human in Arabic. And this creature, genetically modified creature that can now speak, becomes a prophet, you know, and starts speaking about climate change and about how we're, you know, about its sort of its fate. And I use it as sort of like a messenger in my films to kind of speak about these broader issues. So it no longer becomes about me as a filmmaker, you know, which is oftentimes seen in science films, speaking about, you know, kind of these activists or films that really kind of preach, you know, how we're destroying our planet. I use the animals as sort of my vehicle to tell these stories. And as a side note, a lot of research is being done recently where people are trying to create these chimeras, like human-animal chimeras. And we're starting to humanize our animals. The reason why we do that is because we want to study human genes and human factors, and we put it into the animals. And I already mentioned this idea, the fluorescent gene. We take it from one animal and we put it into the other one. So we're also kind of blurring the lines between what animals are between themselves, and we're also blurring the lines between animal and humans. And there is research happening recently about trying to understand the origin of language and whether or not it's a genetic component, you know, how much of it is sort of environmentally influenced. And there was a New York Times article that I read a few years ago that inspired this film about how they're genetically modifying mice with this gene called FOXP2 to see whether or not they can vocalize and they can actually speak. What would happen if an animal spoke? Would it speak about its condition? Would it be able to understand its state of consciousness? Would it be able to predict the future? These are some of the questions that sort of I'm interested in. But back to flies, because this has been part of my world. I haven't progressed that much because I went from flies and then I went to butterflies, so I'm still sort of in that realm of insects. But this is images of fruit flies shot in a bottle, what we call a milk bottle, which is often used to keep these. And this is shot with a camera called a phantom camera. I don't know if anybody's ever used a phantom camera, but these are slow motion cameras where you can shoot up to 2,000 frames a second. So the way it works is that you have like sort of this trigger, and you know, if you're shooting like 1 second, it becomes like a 5-minute. You know, you're shooting highly slow. It's used a lot in sports, for example, and in basketball and other sports. But I became sort of fascinated by just, you know, a similar way as I was using the microscope to look at these animals, to film them and have them take presence in the films that I have. And so many of the films that I make, there are these moments where we're just with the animals. We're just sort of observing them, and they become, you know, they become sort of characters in the films that I construct. And this is actually part of my first feature, The Fly Room, that I showed. Actually, I showed it a few days ago here at the CNRS. I had another screening a few days ago. But this is a film. This was my first feature that I started when I was a PhD student, and it took me 10 years to make this film. I finished my PhD, and then I did NYU Film School. I was in the NYU Film program at Tisch, where I also teach now. And basically, this was a film where I was interested in understanding sort of the history of how we work on fruit flies. And very briefly, I'll just give like a very kind of brief note about it. Most of what we understand about genetics, and the fact that we have genes, just to begin with, like the sort of the identity of a gene, comes from research on flies. And it was a lab at Columbia in the early 1900s called the Fly Room, where they discovered the principles of modern genetics. And these guys that worked there were referred to as the Fly Boys. They were, this was in between this was like the 1920s by the time they started getting a little bit more exposure about their research. But this was in between the wars, and these were scientists that were very involved in the art movement in the Village in New York. Many of them were associated to sort of many different political movements, and anarchist and communism. But I was really interested in this space because this was a space where genetics was discovered, and as I was doing research about this film, I came across the fact that the daughter of one of the scientists was still alive. She was 95 years old, and she was the daughter of one of the scientists that, you know, is sort of the father of modern genetics. And I spent 3 years interviewing her, and this became the basis of my first feature, which is basically the sort of the recollection, her memories of spending a day with her father in his lab in the 1920s and discovering this world of insects. Has anybody seen Pan's Labyrinth? So it has like elements of that, where she enters into this space and there's insects everywhere, and her father's there, and she starts seeing her father as a fly, and she discovers that her father is unfaithful to the mother. And so it becomes like both a space of knowledge and a space of horror that she experiences over the course of one day. And it's also about this little girl trying to understand her own genetic relationship to her father, and understanding, you know, even him explaining what genetics is, and then discovering that he's also a terrible father, because she sees him in you know, she sees what's happening behind the scenes. So I thought I would share with you a clip of that film. So.
Nature is untouched. It is effortlessly beautiful, loving without words and caring without arms. It spreads tiny dots of magic into the world around it, secretly knowing that new life will come. It lights up the world, it lights up the people. It invisibly dances and sings, happiness it brings.
Talking to anyone while they're working, and especially in the photographs in the lab. Can you see the dog spot?
Yeah.
That's meconium. Meconium is Yes. No, what? They're contaminated, Jack.
That's the real Betsy.
You think I don't know? You think I can't see?
So that was sort of my first feature film that I shot as a thesis film at NYU Film School, and oddly enough, my advisor and who I received support from, and it was a big part of that, was Spike Lee. Spike Lee, who's the artistic director of the NYU Film Program, and he was very invested and helped me quite a bit in making this film. And what was challenging but also interesting was the fact that most of the film was shot in one space. You know, we recreated the fly room in Brooklyn in Red Hook, and so it had kind of like a mise en scène, like a theatrical aspect to it, which was kind of using this fly room as a metaphor of her being sort of stuck inside of a milk bottle with the flies, you know, kind of a representation of her in this world and couldn't sort of escape from it. And incorporating, as I mentioned before, incorporating these elements of documentary and voiceover from the real Betsy, who you see there at the end there, and this was excerpts from the interviews that I did with her, but also allowing me to kind of, you know, be historical about what happened in the space, but also enter into these states, going back to Benoit's part, enter into these states of dreams and enter into these states of what is actually the animal, the insect, you know, because the insects are sort of the witness of what's happening between a father and a daughter. And what happens if suddenly the camera is shifted to a fruit fly looking at this little girl and her father, and whether or not they would have, like, you know, almost like witnesses of history and of this memory. Something else that is a big part of my work is also how memory is inconsistent, you know, and as we remember things, we also add layers of fiction. Every time you recall a memory, you know, remember first time that you went biking, for example. Every time you recall a memory and you have little gaps, the way in which we remember things is that we need to create narratives and stories. And so it's very common for us to patch those moments with potential elements that may be fiction. And it happens quite often that you'll remember something and be like, oh, my bike was red. And then you suddenly watch a video of it and you realize that it was a different color. So we have a tendency of, you know, adding these layers of fiction to remember things as well. So this brings me to the last film that I shot, which was luckily I shot it right before the pandemic. We were editing during the pandemic. I actually edited here in Paris in the gallery. I have a small gallery here in the 20th that you should all come to when it's open. It's not that often open. And this is Son of Monarchs, which will be the screening at 5 o'clock. And the actor is in Wakanda Forever. I don't know if anybody's seen Wakanda, but this is Tenoch Huerta. He plays the sort of the king of the underwater ocean. He wears this amazing green bathing suit. He's amazing. And Tenoch, you know, it's a film about a scientist, a Mexican scientist who works on butterflies in the U.S. And it's a film that mixes how we study sort of the world of studying how butterflies create the colors and the patterns that they have. You know, like, why do they have the colors and why do they have those patterns? And how do they sort of develop into butterflies? But it's also a story about immigration. What does it mean to be living in between two countries, and what does it mean to be, you know, like a Latino immigrant? And the other aspect of the film was to show sort of a different Latin American representation of migration, because oftentimes when you watch films, especially about Mexicans, it's about crossing the border, but this was really about a Mexican in, you know, a PhD, like a researcher that is trying to understand his childhood and his past and he does it in a way through his research, through the butterflies. And not to give anything away, but there's elements of it that, you know, I'm doing more and more of it actually, because my work is sort of entering into more of the science fiction realm, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. But he sort of turns into a butterfly. He sort of transforms his body into a butterfly, and he sort of becomes this, like, you know, he goes through like this metamorphosis. And so this is something that I love, is like shooting in labs, you know, and this is, you know, we kind of used a lab at NYU, and what you see here is just like him in this like refuge, like in his space. What I find amazing about laboratories is that, and it's also kind of was the case in my life, is that he's in New York, but it's sort of this like place of meditation where, you know, you're surrounded by all of these, like, you know, the butterfly food and ways in which you pin the butterflies and the centrifuge, and, you know, him listening to his music, and it's just like this sanctuary of, you know, where you're somewhat studying life, but in this like very odd, sterile, you know, world. And also the, you know, I'm fascinated by sort of the production design of these spaces, but both like having scientific imagery, but also, you know, potential photos of your family, and all of these spaces that kind of come together. And again, the microscope is a very big part of my work. Is when we look through a microscope, and this was the case also for me, we tend to sort of enter into these other worlds, right? We're looking, and this is something that we'll do later on in the workshop, we enter into like another dimension. And it's almost reminds me of like early cinema, when we had like like when we would look through, you know, like these like little peepholes, and we would look at films. It has sort of that effect. And the opening scene of the film is him looking through a microscope, and sort of him triggering, kind of trying to understand his past and his childhood. And one of the things that I did in this film, as part of sort of the research process, is collecting as much butterfly footage as possible, and using that as a way in which I would not only kind of potentially use it in the film, but as a way in which I could sort of develop the script. Because when I look at, so this is a butterfly chrysalis, and these are experiments that are done at UC Berkeley in the Patel lab, and what they do is that they kind of shave off a little bit of the sort of the shell of the chrysalis, and they use these cameras where they can actually look in real time at the development of a butterfly. This is a butterfly wing that is being developed. And what you'll see here is sort of the veins of that wing, and suddenly, pretty late onset, suddenly pigmentation is going to start popping up, and you're going to see this like amazing colors that are going to start, you know, it's almost like it starts, you know, the painting process begins. And it has sort of this like iridescent blue color initially, and then suddenly coming up here, you're going to see the colors that are going to be coming through. And so this was fascinating to me, because it was also, you know, like how does an organism decide at what point it needs to create these shapes and colors? You know, what are the kind of the genetic underpinnings of that? Look at that. It's like amazing. I could watch this for hours. And this is actually, I became not really an expert, but I know my butterflies now. If I spot them, I also know my fruit flies, I can tell you. But this is a buckeye butterfly because it has these eye spots on it. And let me ask a question, like why would a butterfly have those colors and patterns? What would be the reason for that? Yeah.
To like make their predators think they're poisonous.
To make the predators feel like they're poisonous? Yeah. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
To have fake eyes to ward off predators. I don't really know the evolutionary reason, but something along those lines.
Exactly. There's like an aspect of like animal mimicry, that they're using the eyes as a way of kind of, you know, veering off the predators. So it's both a way in which they can, you know, sort of make sure that the predators don't come to them, and then at the same time it's a way in which they can like court other, you know, what's fascinating is that the way in which butterflies see each other is not the ways in which we see them, right? They have their own sort of visual coding that happens between them, but it's very important for survival. It's very important for them, you know, and it's an interesting concept when you think about it, because, you know, we speak so much about, you know, topics around, you know, like racism and the color of our skin and all of these things, and when we think about it, why do we have those colors? Why do we have these like diversity of things? And so I thought it was interesting to have a scientist that is sort of dealing with his own identity crisis, but at the same time studies what are the underpinnings of color and patterns in a butterfly wing. And so, so this is something that that is big in the work that I do, is not forgetting that that data, especially scientific data, but other types of data, also archival footage, is also cinema. That you can take these elements and you can use these elements as a way to speak about, I'm going to show you like a butterfly chrysalis and I'm going to explain what it is. But if you take it out of its context and put it into a different context, it can have a totally different meaning, right? If you put it, for example, in somebody's dream, suddenly that footage that was taken by a scientist in a laboratory, it suddenly takes on a whole different perspective. And we now have films that have all kinds of visual effects, but what happens when we take this element and we put it into films, and not forget that they also have this sort of ability to become cinema and have a cinema quality. And if you look at the manifesto, one of the traits is experiments become cinema. This idea that these experiments that we do in the labs also have sort of, the cinematic quality to them.
Science can take.
So, coming to the platform, because a lot of this also connects to the platform that I developed. If you go to the platform, you'll notice that there's a section of it called scenes. And scenes, these are not films. This is scientific footage, and the idea of that section of the platform, it's a little bit like Shutterstock or Pond5 or these other ones, is having scientists provide us with their data and have artists be able to use that. Whether you're a filmmaker, whether you're a performer, whether you're a musician, there's been all kinds of situations. Like the band Animal Collective recently collaborated with a group in Miami where they made a music video with Coral Reef. But having this footage be used by artists, right? And so I'll show you a little clip about this idea of the data.
Science can take many forms, like this, or any of these, because it's definitely not limited to just this one.
I think that was it. So this brings me to, is everybody still with me? Are we still here? Yeah? I'm going to ask you questions just to make sure that you're still around. So because I was also quite saddened by the fact that I had left the science world, that I sort of veered into the film world, now part of my work as a filmmaker is that I get to go back to the lab and I get to film, and I get to shadow scientists. And I retired at a young age as a molecular biologist, but I sort of speak the language and I come in there and I'm thinking a lot about, how do we have scientists also perform for cinema? How do they become actors, and how do I get them involved not only as advisors to films, which we oftentimes see like, Minority Report or Inception, and they talk about, that they got science advisors as part of it, but actually having the scientists be involved in the film. And so this is me shooting with a Canon C300 and sort of, hacking these microscopes to be able to shoot through them. And this is me trying to shoot butterfly wings, but also shoot dissections. A lot of what the scientists do is that they dissect and they try to, for example, remove a butterfly wing. And it's almost like very high, it's like acting under pressure, because you have to act with your hands and you have to do dissections. And the opening scene of Son of Monarchs is somebody dissecting a butterfly chrysalis and sort of taking out the wing. And I find it amazing. It's almost like food, like like when you're filming food or counter filmmaking, but in this case, kind of shooting in that space. And what you see here is using different microscopes. These are different highly magnified microscopes that allow you to see the butterfly wings up close. And what's amazing about a butterfly wing is that it's made up of these scales, like fish scales, right? And what may seem like one color, if you go very up close, you'll see that there's a lot more sort of range and noise within those colors. So you'll see that, you know, there's orange scales and black and white, and it's just amazing to think about sort of the structures of these butterfly wings. And this is a big part of the films that I make. So what I'm going to show you now is an installation that I did, and something that I do as I prepare films is that it's very hard, for those of you that want to make films, it's a hard and long process, right, to make a film, to make a feature film. And we live in a time now where we can go back and forth between filming and writing, you know. And a lot of the time, in order to get people to support your films and have that community of people that will allow you to make a film that is very costly, you need to sort of show them, it's almost like a research project. It's more than just writing a script. So what I end up doing is that I shoot these short films in the making of the film, and I explain to them a little bit, okay, this is how I'm imagining, you know, the butterfly world, or this is a few short films about the scientist transforming into a butterfly. And I use those films to then go back to the writing, but also get actors involved. For example, Tenoch Huerta, he had seen a trilogy of films that I had made and then decided to be in the feature film. But this is how I sort of build momentum to make the films that I do. And something else what I'll talk a little bit about after the film portion is how do I also have these films be shown not only in cinema settings, but also in gallery spaces, in scientific institutions. And this was an exhibit that I did in New York, where basically with all of the imaging that I did with the butterflies, I did this piece about, that kind of speaks about the immigration sort of tensions that were happening in the prior administration. I'm not going to even mention that president's name, but I was using the wing and us going very, very close into the microscopic world of the wing and overlapping that with voices of undocumented workers. So I'll show you that. And I think we can. So as we're getting closer, we're crossing the border between the US and Mexico. And also using the butterfly, the division between color, as a sort of a representation of the wall between countries. Right? So, this is my strange mind at work here. But again, it's this idea of how do I take this image, these images that were done through microscopy and stitched together to create sort of this fluid movement, and how do I start adding my own stories on top of it? Again, recontextualizing the scientific data into sort of other, you know, political and cultural kind of discourse. And so this is something that is a big part of my work. And something that we'll do later on is sort of this relationship between the macro and micro. How do I kind of create these relationships between thinking about borders between countries or about landscapes and how that sort of is represented on a butterfly wing. The one small note that I'll mention is that there are not only genes that are involved in helping figure out what the colors are of the butterfly wing, but there are genes that are responsible for creating borders. Meaning that when you don't have those genes, there are no borders, meaning that the colors start bleeding into each other. And so that's also fascinating, this idea of what we refer to as like segmentation or bordering as sort of like a genetic aspect. And giving you sort of like clues into how I work, I'm really interested in kind of creating these Venn diagrams where I think about, okay, so this is a film that's going to combine science and rituals. It's also a film that's going to be happening between New York and Mexico. There's an aspect of it which is about kind of the earth, but also the sky, because we're dealing with butterflies, and thinking a little bit about, you know, this ideas of how can I create sort of similarities with a ritual about becoming an animal, but also in the lab, how does he also become an animal? And so I kind of create these Venn diagrams and these schematic representations. The idea of transformation, how can I actually create that both at a ritual level, but also at a scientific level, and so on and so forth. And I'll quickly go through this because I want to leave time for questions. But these are small clips from some of the short films that I made as part of sort of the lead up to the feature. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead, which is sort of the day where, you know, everybody sort of mourns their ancestors. In the parts of Mexico and Michoacan where the butterflies arrive, the butterflies represent the souls of the ancestors. So the butterfly actually represents the ancestors coming back. And again, this is something that I incorporated into the film. And then the butterfly as activism, right? This was a big part of my film, where undocumented workers were using the butterfly as a way to speak about human rights. You know, we are all butterflies. We are all monarch butterflies. I should mention that the monarch butterfly migrates from Canada through the US and arrives in Mexico. It travels 5,000 kilometers, and it's an endangered species. But it has three identities. It's Canadian, American, and Mexican. And there was a lot of people using the monarch butterfly as sort of this representation. And this is Cesar Maxit. He's an Argentinian activist. And if you look at his monarch butterfly, and if you look closely, he took sort of the patterns and colors, but he actually put these fists. If you notice, sort of almost like an optical illusion. So you have like 4 fists, and then the white spots are actually footsteps. And so he reappropriates the colors to also have these aspects of activism as well. And these are just clips of my film as well. And again, I'm showing you like little snippets of the film. When the butterflies arrive in Mexico, all the kids in these towns, they dress up as butterflies. So the girls are obviously the butterflies. The boys, they're not as like developed. They're only trees, and they're also like, the boys have to hide. Actually, some of the boys are also trees, and they're caterpillars. And you'll know that the girls are like, well, we're the butterflies. You guys are just like still in developing stages. And again, this was amazing because they were doing these dances to welcome the butterflies arriving. And I remember I was doing some documentary footage on this dance, and I noticed that some of the girls would like crowd together and they would start shivering. And I asked the teacher, you know, what are they doing? And she said they're actually kind of reenacting climate change because there are not enough trees, and so they're cold. So this idea of deforestation was actually part of the dance, which was mind-blowing to me. And this is me kind of shooting some of these early films and going, if you haven't been there yet, you have to go to the butterfly sanctuaries, because it's millions of butterflies that arrive and hibernate in these forests. And I made a film about these 2 butterfly clowns here. They're the last 2 monarch butterflies on the planet, and the story is something like this. The male butterfly dies, so the female butterfly arrives on the Day of the Dead, and she screams and she kills all of humanity with a scream. And it's about the revenge of a butterfly. And I'll show you a little trailer of the film.
In the Day of the Dead, in Mexico, the butterflies arrive and they are the soul of our relatives.
Tú tienes un alma vieja. Acuérdate que no eres frágil, eres fuerte.
Yo utilizo CRISPR-Cas9 para modificar los colores de las alas de la mariposa. Explica la evolución, explica la biodiversidad. This is the back eye, optics removed. The orange is blue now.
¿Y cómo un animal así puede hacer ese color?
Las instrucciones para colorearla están escritas en el código genético. Esto ayuda al insecto a camuflarse o a atraer a sus parejas.
Emre, soy tu tío, Gabino. Tu abuelita no está muy bien.
What's going on with you?
How can I remember what happened? Son flashes.
Estoy muerto.
Todos los recuerdos que yo tengo son los que tú me metiste en la cabeza.
The revolution in the technology is that it gives us a cursor, so we can pinpoint exactly the gene we want to work on.
You can make the butterfly invisible.
If you change the sequence, then you change the color. Estás buscando más bien el origen de la vida, mijo.
Are you sure? You want to put this in your skin?
¿Y te casaste?
¿Estás contento ya? Te voy a extrañar, carnal.
You gotta accept that, you gotta honor it, you gotta celebrate it. This is you.
¡Vente, vente! ¡Ven, súbete, súbete!
So I hope everybody will come to the screening. And it was a really fun process because many of the scenes were actually shot. So when we were shooting in Mexico, even though it was a fictional film, we used a lot of the locals for the rituals, and the kids were part of it. So again, using non-actors, using scientists in the films is something that I'm quite interested in doing. And also having scientists not only act as scientists, but give them this like freedom to also dream and kind of, for a moment, through the power of cinema, escape from their, you know, when we ask a scientist to tell something on video, they go into these like robotic, like, I'm going to speak about my research or about these broader issues, but allow them, what I often do when I interview scientists is I ask them about their dreams. Can you tell me about, and one of the scientists that I interviewed, he said, I wish, I once had a dream that I actually tattooed myself with butterfly pigments. And he was a butterfly scientist, and I said, oh, maybe me as the filmmaker, I should realize that dream for him. I should actually make that dream possible. So that's how I incorporated the idea of the tattoo and him injecting butterfly pigment into his skin, which was a crazy idea. I'll go through this quickly. These are some of the projects that I'm working on now. This is a film called The Next Jaguar. It's about how we're bringing back animals from the dead, a little bit like Jurassic Park. And it's really a film about how we're storing humanity in, again, about chimeras, and that the only way to save humanity is by putting bits and pieces of our humanity inside the animals, kind of creating Noah's Ark by creating a memory of humanity inside of the animals. And these will be kind of the future creatures that will have a history of us. And so this is a project that I'm working on right now. Another one is on the scientist from the 1900s. His name is Ramon y Cajal. He's basically the father of the brain. He discovered the neuron. He discovered that our brain is composed of interconnected neurons. He was also involved in early photography. He knew, for example, I mean, he was in contact with a lot of the surrealists at the time, but these are some of his drawings that he did. This is a drawing of the cerebellum in the brain, and this just shows you kind of the intricate neuronal connections of the brain. But he also wrote science fiction stories. And my film is sort of going to be about his life, mixing in the stories of science fiction, a little bit like the series like Black Mirror. There will be like these science fiction stories that will be sort of intertwined with his life. And when he dreams, because again, dreams are a big part of my films, he's going to dream about the future of how we think about the brain. which is a big topic nowadays, is like, can we actually map the brain? Can we actually understand how the brain works? Can we understand aspects around decision making, the coding or the decoding of the brain? Do I have time to show this little video? Okay, so this is a short film that I did with Bardem, not Javier Bardem, but his brother, Carlos Bardem. And it's based on a short science fiction story by Cajal about a man who wakes up one day and he can see the world through as if he had a microscope as eyes. So I'll show you this.
Muchos son mis nombres. Llámame el filósofo intuición, el científico casualidad feliz, el artista inspiración. Soy quien en el laboratorio del sabio o en el retiro del pensador sugiero las ideas fecundas, las experiencias decisivas, las intuiciones felices, las síntesis augustas y triunfadoras. Cuando, muy entrada ya la mañana, me llamó la atención un fenómeno insólito. Mis ojos se habían convertido en microscopios, y no en virtud de alteraciones en la dióptrica ocular, imposibles, por otra parte, sin cambiar la forma y dimensión del aparato visual, sino a causa de la extremada finura de la organización retiniana y vías ópticas. Cada cono o célula impresionable de la fovea centralis había sido descompuesta en centenares de sutilísimos filamentos individuales, excitables, y la misma multiplicación de conductores había sobrevenido también en los nervios ópticos y centros visuales del cerebro. Las hojas de los árboles parecían construidas de las innumerables piezas poliédricas, opalinas y translúcidas, en cuyo esperar se divisaban acúmulos irregulares de esferas verdes, o sea, de granos de clorofila y otros corpúsculos incoloros. Podía pensar, recobrar la posesión de sí mismo buceando en el revuelto mar de sus recuerdos, en el cual, necesitaba remontarse muy atrás, recorrer casi enteramente el registro de la juventud, para topar con alguna grata remembranza compensadora del amargo presente y confortadora de sus desmayos. Para la poderosa retina de Dios no hay distancia ni rigen las leyes de la perspectiva, pues en ella se pintan con igual claridad y relieve el mar y las olas, los átomos y los astros. En su visión luminosa, sintética y analítica a la par, se le ofrecen las vidas individuales cual moléculas perpetuamente renovadas de un piélago de protoplasma, en cuyas espumas y oleajes columbra ya las formas puras y aladas del porvenir, única humanidad digna de él. Porque habrá sabido descorrer en parte la tupida cortina de malla y podrá asomarse sin vértigos al insondable abismo de las realidades eternas. Todo ser humano, si se lo propone, puede ser escultor de su propio cerebro.
So, and I'll quickly go through the rest here, but a lot of the work that I do also is kind of experimenting with form, and this was an opportunity to also think about how I could take these science fiction stories and use animation that would sort of pay tribute to his original kind of techniques and how he drew, you know, so kind of use this animation where he would kind of become, you know, he would almost be sketched on his own drawings, you know, it would be kind of him represented, and so it was kind of this idea of him merging with his own drawings that he did of the brain. And so this is, again, this is the early process of me trying to make a feature film, or we're not sure if it's going to be a feature or episodic series, and we're right now in discussion with HBO about potentially doing something which would be like a 5-part series, but it's me trying to take these ideas and start playing with them, you know, almost like material, and saying, okay, let me experiment with animation, let me try to convince some actors to do the voiceover, and I start building this community. And Bardem, Carlos Bardem, who's also an actor, the whole family are actors, he's also a writer, and he sort of agreed to read some of it, and this is actually from Cajal's science fiction stories. So I'm going to do a full 180 here, but in addition to making films, a big part of my own trajectory in my own life has been running a festival that I started 15 years ago, which is called Imagine Science Films, which Isabelle was part of last year. And this is a festival that was started by scientists. Nobody had any experience with film. And the idea was to have scientists sort of take the lead in how they wanted films about their work and about their lives to be represented. And the idea was to really celebrate the many forms of science filmmaking. And also take over many spaces. And we were talking with Emre about, you mentioned in Brighton, like being in different venues. We go all around New York City, it happens in New York, and we are in universities, in cabarets, in bars, in cinemas, in universities, and it's a traveling circus that happens at all of these venues before this was, you know, before the pandemic, and then we also did it last year. And to really kind of get as many people to watch these films, and also encourage scientists to make films, to kind of give their footage and provide it to the festival. And the festival happens in New York, but we've had many sort of additions, like almost like satellite events that have happened in different cities. You know, we've been in Abu Dhabi, Dublin, Hong Kong, here in Paris. And, you know, we have documentary fiction, music videos, experimental work. Again, the venues and the awards. And what Isabelle was part of and how actually we met, she was part of this competition called Symbiosis, where we pair scientists and filmmakers for a week, and they make a film together. And they're randomly paired, and midway through the process, they have to give a lab meeting, which is kind of speaking about their collaboration and how they're working together, and how they're, you know, how they're just exchanging ideas and footage. But it is a film that is ultimately made by both. It's not about the filmmaker making a film. It's really about sort of a collaboration where they're both directors and they're both thinking about these films. That's one aspect of the festival. And the other one, which I mentioned before, is this idea of kind of taking scientific footage and showing it in movie theaters. So in between the films, we show footage that's taken from labs, and we provide it, and we kind of embed it into the festival. And this is also something that I do in my own films, and something that we'll also do later on in this workshop, is taking images, you know, up close, like macro, and trying to find relationships between the macro world, like the very highly magnified world, and the world at large, and kind of creating those relationships. And lastly, an extension to Imagine Science has been creating a platform called Labocine, which is, the idea of the platform was to really extend this sort of community of artists and scientists, and have a platform that is a streaming platform where you can watch films, but you can also, in similar ways as like LinkedIn, you can have a profile with your films. And so Isabelle has one, or I have one, and you have the films that you've made, and you can also, what we're going to start doing is we're going to also have people start collaborating on the platform. But the other aspect is to really also have institutions be part of the platform, so that when they're teaching classes either about, you know, docufiction or about, you know, science courses, they can actually show films that are made, you know, kind of show the diversity of films that are made. Like, let's say you're teaching a class about endangered species. Show students films that are not only documentaries, but fiction, performances, video art pieces, so that they learn about these topics through many different types of filmmaking. And I'll show you a little trailer of that, and I'm done. Actually, I didn't speak about the new wave. But... Ah. So I encourage everybody to join. This is my part where I'm like, but Habitat is amazing because you can create a profile, and it's also, the purpose of it is to encourage interdisciplinary work in general. Whether you're an anthropologist interested in making films, is to sort of break this hierarchy of, you know, having streaming platforms that are only focusing on filmmakers or producers. But really, when we have films on the platform, you see the habitat, you see the people that were involved in making the film. It's a little bit more sort of thinking about it not only as like film crews or like the credits of a film, but really what is the habitat that was involved in making this film? Was there an anthropologist? Was there a video artist? Was there a dancer? And so that's what the platform does. Every film that we have, we see the different people that have been involved. And everybody should join Habitat. Oh, I have too many videos, but the other aspect of Habitat is that, you know, whenever you share work, for example, oftentimes you send a Vimeo with a password, is that we can now allow people that want to kind of create their habitats on who they want to share their films with. And so, I mean, it's relatively straightforward, but this idea that you can add people and they have access to your films, but only those little, for each film there's like a habitat of the shared habitat, the people that you want to actually share the films with. I think that's about it. I want to end with the sort of the Science New Wave, really briefly. This idea of kind of, in my life, about not knowing really where I'm from, living in New York, but French, Venezuelan, and then being a biologist, filmmaker. I thought it would be interesting to create a movement because it allows me to sort of structure my own life, but also allows me to have others that are involved in this community respond to the movement. And by responding to a movement and responding to the manifesto that you have, they can also contest it. You see what I mean? They can also have ways in which you think like, well, I was drawn to trait number 3, or I was, you know, I didn't fully agree with this one. And it allows to have a conversation about how, you know, how people respond to this sort of space. And also it helps me when anybody asks me about the films that I make, I just simply tell them that I make films from the New Wave, from the Science New Wave, and they have no idea what that means. So. And again, it was inspired by the French New Wave, and I love this line by Godard: "A story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order." Right before he passed away, Godard did an interview on Instagram where he spoke about his obsession with RNA and DNA, and how he was also related to a scientist called Jacques Monod. But he spoke about how a lot of his films had sort of were reminiscent of how RNA and DNA and this idea of, you know, shuffling genes together. And so when I read this, I immediately think about genetics and how things can be reshuffled. So this idea of having traits instead of rules, and I just want to show you the little video, and then we'll open it up to questions. Sorry, I ran away. And if anybody's interested in seeing any of the work, a lot of my films are actually I've had this rebellious sort of I've like just put my films online now. I don't do any like private. So all of the short films that I make are available on my website, and then there's the platform. And if anybody also wants, if anybody comes through New York, the festival happens in October every year with Magic Science. But yeah, thank you. And if you have any questions.
Yeah, just housekeeping. If you came in late, make sure you sign up before you leave. If I know you were here. So we don't have a whole lot of time. So I had some questions. But you know what? I'm not going to ask them because I get access to you during parts of the day. Anybody have some burning questions or not burning questions? Questions for Alexis? That was an incredibly rich present. I mean, can you tell this guy's got 1,000 things going on? It's amazing. Did I? What?
Yeah, I was just interested.
And tell me about yourself. I'm curious to hear.
Oh,
your name and.
I'm Blake. I'm from Colorado. I'm a film major here, and yeah, I guess.
And what types of films do you make? What types of films?
I've been doing more film theory than production so far, so I haven't made a lot of stuff. But I'm very interested in science fiction. I'm actually taking your science fiction class, which I love. So I'm very interested in your work. And actually, my question pertains to that. I was interested in, do you see yourself sort of shifting away from the documentary research and more towards the sort of fictionalized science fiction, sort of, I don't know, like body horror with the chimeras and everything like that? Do you see yourself moving to a more fictional space?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work is fiction, so the documentary sort of research happens as almost like a precursor to making these films. But I have been asked to early stages of doing a remake of this Hollywood film called The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I don't know if anybody saw that from like the late 50s. So I was asked by Universal Studios to pitch sort of a concept of that. So yeah, I'm definitely moving in that direction of it's almost like thinking about how far I can go into sort of into the space of science fiction, but still be bounded by actual science that's happening today. But as you're watching it, it feels like pure science fiction. You see what I mean? But then as you sort of unravel the pieces, you realize that many of the things that you're watching are actually sort of prominent in that space. But my concept of science fiction is that it's always interesting to have the science fiction be triggered by one of the characters or the animals. You see what I mean? Like almost like I'm not the one doing the science fiction, that these elements of like dystopian worlds or chimeras, it's almost like from the perspective of one of the characters in the film. But yeah, no, I'm definitely moving, and I'm also interested in sort of the like the film industry and finding way. I think there's actually, there's actually more and more interest in bringing science into mainstream, into Hollywood. I mean, I've experienced it myself, and you also like even in like TV shows. I don't know if anybody's watched like The Last of Us or these shows, but there's a lot of like science that is sort of being sort of recontextualized in a lot of these shows. So so definitely, yeah. Long-winded answer, but yes, yeah.
Any questions?
It was a
Susanna?
question.
It was your time.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, because like you said that you were very into like studying insects, and especially like the ones that have like these adaptations, like the butterflies with the colors. I was wondering, like, is there any other aspect of like any other like living creatures or any other aspect of nature that kind of like you see yourself doing, like focusing more on in the future?
Yeah, so right now the animals that I've been focusing on are the jaguar, and about the extinction, because the jaguar has an interesting, in many indigenous cultures, the shaman of like these indigenous cultures has the ability to turn into a jaguar, and so the jaguar is also endangered. So I was thinking about kind of combining this idea of like bringing back the jaguar to life as a way of also preserving indigenous rituals. But I'm also, I think it's a good question, because I've become really interested in not focusing on one animal, but like ecosystems. And I am also working on a film about plants that have the ability to, they're kind of like these rebellious plants that are kind of, you know, rebelling against humanity. So yeah, I have been kind of thinking a little bit about branching out from like individual animals to like thinking about my films as like ecosystems, right? And but other animals that I've been working on is the mouse. The short film that I showed you, the mouse has intrigued me for so long because of our fascination with the mouse. It's also like, you know, our like Disney characters make it, but at the same time, and also the fact that the mouse is used for most of the research on memory, but at the same time we despise it, and so I've been working on something on that as well. So yeah, and the brain, which is not an animal, but yeah. There's
honestly had a really similar question. That's why I was confused. Sorry.
I stole your question. I'm sorry.
To the first question. But I was wondering, like, have you always done like each aspect of your filming? So have you always been like the director, cinematographer, writer, or is there one particular aspect that you like more, or you participate more in now, or something that you specialized in more within that group of things?
Yeah, it's so when I'm shooting these short films, I tend to do many of the roles because it's like very small crews. I oftentimes are really interested in doing the like with the microscopes. But when we shoot feature films, I'm actually not so, I sort of kind of, I become really focused on sound actually when I'm shooting feature films. So when I'm directing, sound is like a big part of my other role on film sets. I kind of leave the cinematography. I mean, I have, you know, it's relatively big crews. I think Son of Monarchs was like 70 people. So there's definitely like a division of labor and in the world there, but I really love also working with actors and with non-actors, and also directing animals is like a big thing of mine. You know, like how do I, you know, spend, and a lot of the filming of these worlds relating to animals and microscopes, a lot of that has to be done separate from the shoot because it takes a lot of time. So I usually do that either in labs where I spend like I go to like a lab and I spend like 2 weeks there, and I put microscopes and I film things, or I do it at home. But I think my interest is I'm really interested in sound design and making sure that all of the sounds that I want to capture happen on set. I'm not so keen on post-production, you know, really trying to avoid like visual effects and those things. I try and sound is like a big part of something that I feel very reluctant to recreate afterwards. So a lot of the voiceovers of the actor, I do it on set. I do everything, and I capture a lot of wild sounds and those types of things. Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
A couple things floating in my mind. This isn't one question, but here are some points that you
throw away.
How you respond. Science, pretty depressing field currently. How do you deal with that?
You mean like the state of the world?
Well,
yeah.
You work with climate change topics, that and migration and the endangered species. So there's one point thinking about, is that a depressing thing for you, or is that more of a hopeful thing or something? Then the ethics of working with so many laboratory type settings and animals that are in closed environments, things like that. And then with the chimera things and how that's the only way to save humanity, mentioned that before. Just a big question mark.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, it's like I could go for like an hour. Yeah, I'm not so interested in having kind of like scientific, like, my films are really sort of character based, so any topics around are hopeful. Huh? What do you mean me? No, but we're talking about like how do I deal with science being depressing?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, that I don't necessarily want to kind of go into those. So it's a lot of times it's through my characters that I kind of mention whether or not they feel hopeful or depressed about kind of the state of climate change. So I don't really, me as a filmmaker, I don't really sort of provide like an overall message about how I feel about those topics. There is a sense in science about both, you know, we can change so many things, we can tinker with life, but at the same time, we're at a point of no return. Like we can't actually do anything about it. Like we can't do anything about climate change. And for me, a lot of my work is really just having these scientists, through the relationships that they have with their research, mention or evoke aspects around deforestation, around endangered species, but I'm not so interested in kind of imposing kind of my own topic on that. So in terms of the chimeras, it's just that chimeras are, we are chimeras to begin with. You know, our bodies are full of chimeras. We are coated with microbes. Our genome is full of viruses. So there's something about us that we are already kind of chimeric beings to begin with. But there is no denying that a lot of the research that we're doing nowadays to understand human disease and development involves taking human parts and putting them into other animals. So, for example, organ shortage. We're using animals as incubators to harvest human organs. Or we're taking specific genes and we're using animals as kind of like testing, you know, living organisms. And so it's highly problematic, but at the same time it raises questions about what we think, you know, how human can an animal be before we actually give that animal human rights. You know, like this idea of, you know, by humanizing an animal, are we also dehumanizing us, you know? And there are many questions that are brought up now because chimeras have been part of mythology. I mean, they've been part of our history, but now we're reaching a point where we're actually able to create the chimeras that we once invoked and once imagined. And there's a lot of questions about who should, you know, should we be allowed to do this if it's in the name of science or medicine? Who should be the ones involved in terms of the decision making? But then there's a lot of philosophical questions about, you know, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be non-human? So it's a question that is, it's a big part of my work is about identity in general, like who we are. You know, in Son of Monarchs, you know, he has multiple identities as a scientist. You know, he's also Mexican but lives in the US, and he's trying to figure out, you know, how all these identities kind of come together. So in a general sense, this idea of chimeras is sort of a big part of my work because it kind of raises like existential questions on who we are. And then the last question was about animals. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work is I'm kind of providing the public with a window into how scientists are actually studying animals. You know, so the idea is like, how do we observe animals, and you know, what do we find to be, you know, the ethics of it is something that, of course, you know, should we be tinkering with these animals in order to understand aspects about our own human development, human disease, and you know, there's all these kind of animal rights situations that come in. My goal is to kind of give you a window into that world and why we do that research. And you know, I'm not, you know, sacrificing any animals or whatnot. So, but I'm just interested in kind of entering into that space. So.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Gabriella.
Did you make that animation, or did you hire
No, I had an Indian animator that helped me with that. So what I provided him with were the original drawings of Cajal, and then he used that as sort of like the palette, you know, the aesthetics of the animation through that. So I would have loved to make those animations, but I think, yeah. And that is so there's 5 science fiction stories that were published by Cajal, and I'm actually adapting each one of them through this sort of animated technique. So.
I'm interested in mixed media animation and how that sounds cool to see.
Well, right. So that was a big part of it, and also kind of mixing archival photography of his own life, and then having these like images of the brain today. So kind of mixing all of that with the animation. So this is something that I'm also quite fascinated about. It's like, how do you, when you have multiple forms, when you're combining, for example, animation with live action, like what are the moments where you can veer from one space to the other? Like what activates this transition, or what are moments where you want to kind of superimpose both? And it's something that I continuously think about in my research. So.
Okay, let's big round of applause for
Thank you. Thank you so much. And join Habitat, and if anybody wants to keep speaking, you can reach out to me. Yeah.